the Swiss Finance Council published a discussion paper, and before I start discussing this discussion paper with David, I just wanted to thank the contributors to this paper. First of all, Elke König has written a contribution, but also Michel Prada and Masako Ono from the OECD, and we also had the right to reproduce a conference presentation by Sabine Lautenschläger. I think this kind of shows the support that is in the institutions in Europe, but also internationally, to keep up the fight for international standards. Now, I'm sitting next to a very big man, and he's not only tall, but he towers over European affairs and regulations for a long time. He was one of the wonder boys in the Jacques Delors' cabinet. He worked with Shirley in Britain. He was an advisor to Jacques Santer. He was a member and a secretary to Lamfalussy and the De La Rosière Group. He was the Deputy Director General of DG FISMA, and then he did some really, really great work at IOSCO during the crisis. So this man has international standards in his DNA, and we're very proud that David has accepted to help us with this study, and in fact, he's written the first chapter, and I would very much like to invite those of you who are interested in the history of financial supervisory cooperation, not only at the European level, but also at the international level, to read this chapter. And the recommendations of this discussion paper are actually largely copy-pasted from what he'd done, I have to admit. So, and in fact, there are 3 blocks of recommendations. The first block really looks at the standard setting and the governance around the standard setting. The second block looks at the implementation of the standards and the incentives for jurisdictions to implement international standards. And we all know today this is one of the more difficult issues. And then the third block looks at Europe and what the role of Europe and the European Commission can be going forward. So let's kick off this discussion, David. If you had to sort of pick your favorite recommendation in the menu that we put up there, what do you think would be the essential element that we should start like right away?
Well, thank you, Judith. Before I try to answer that impossible question, let me thank Ambassador Lautenberg, yourself and your staffs for being able to contribute to this debate. It's a debate that I think is immensely important, and I've been sounding off on this for some time. So I'm greatly honored by that, and greatly honored to be here and seeing so many close friends and colleagues. I mean, the starting point, and I want to just start rather generally, is what sort of world do we want here? I mean, do we want to develop global rules, global rulemaking for markets that are integrating around the world, or not? I mean, I was in with my wife last week in Kuala Lumpur. The Malaysians have just announced a connector. They're going to connect their markets up with Singapore, as Hong Kong is progressively doing with China. And this is just the beginning. We are going to see, over time, and probably much quicker than we think, big capital markets develop around the world. Not just in Europe, not just in London, not just in the United States, but in a number of other countries. Let's just put the number at 8 to 10 over a medium-term framework. So how are we going to cooperate and make sure that capital can flow around the global world and the global integration that's carrying on? And it will carry on because technology is driving us there. I mean, are we going to have 8 sets of rules, 8 equivalence to requirements? Because if Europe imposes equivalence requirements, you can be absolutely certain the Chinese will do the same. So that is an 8 by 8 matrix of incredible complexity. So I don't think that can work. I think we need far more efforts, not just to converge our standards, but to implement and enforce them. And I know it's difficult. We all know that. We've got a WTO dispute settlement system, actually, which is perhaps the unsung hero of this crisis. it has avoided governments, contracting parties in the WTO from taking the worst sort of protectionist measures. And now we understand the United States wants to weaken that. Well, I really don't think that's the right way to go. So you asked me what's the most important thing here. The most important thing is leadership, and I think this is a great opportunity for Europe to lead the coalition of the willing to strengthen the global system. Not for now, not necessarily so much for now, but for the future, and to ensure that the standards we all agree, and you can put in any type of mechanism for agreement. You can have unanimity, 80%, whatever rules you want, and then enforce them. The enforcement part's difficult. The WTO enforcement part is difficult. But if you don't have that, we are going to end up with more and more fragmentation, more and more bilateral difficulties in a world that is growing. Now, just think about the European Union for 1 second here. What is the European Union? It's a treaty-based organization. It's rules, and the rules can be enforced through the European Court of Justice. Imagine the European Union today just based on recommendations. No directives whatsoever. Our whole system will be based on recommendations. Do you think goods and services would flow around the European Union as they do today? I can tell you one thing. You can be certain they would not. So I come back to my basic point here. What do we want? What do we want for a world that is becoming more integrated, bigger capital markets in more jurisdictions? And I believe it's absolutely essential to strengthen the global system.
And you hope and you see that the European Union can play maybe more of a leadership role in this debate?
I do, and I've said that for a long time. I think there is a huge benefit for the European Union to do that. Let's just take an example. Michel Prada is here, the chairman of the IFRS trustees. I don't think we would have a pretty well global accounting system, ex the United States, with US GAAP, if the European Union had not moved at the beginning of 2000 to adopt the International Accounting Standards System. Today, there are 120 or so, Michel, countries in the world who are adopting those standards. Not perfectly. Maybe we should have some enforcement here, but at least there is a strong convergent movement towards international accounting. That was triggered by the European Union's move. And I say that because last week I saw Sir David Tweedy, the chairman of the ISB at the time, and he said exactly those words. Where should Europe deepen its efforts? Certainly in Asia, certainly in Latin America. I think we're beginning to see that on the trade side, but I would like to see much more on the financial regulatory side as well. And I just don't see, frankly, differences of rules, differences of implementation of rules. What is that? Now, that is simply extra cost, deadweight loss of no use whatsoever to the global economy.
One last question before we leave the discussion to the excellent panel that we have here. David, what do you think are the opportunities maybe in terms of supervisory cooperation in the future? Do you think technology can play a role?
Well, I think that in all of this, if you strengthen the global system, you draw up your rules in a much more sensible way, so you cooperate ex ante to avoid ex post repair. You install a serious dispute settlement system with sanctioning powers. It's going to have to have sanctioning powers. I think there is a huge opening now for supervisors around the world to build two things. First of all, to build real-time data reporting systems. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever why regulators today and supervisors should not have the data they need real-time, right now. So if a regulator wants to know exposure of his country or whatever to, let's say, Russian bonds, they shouldn't have to wait weeks to get it. And secondly, I think that through that system and cooperating on a cross-border basis, and I mean deep cooperation, a step change from where we are today. We have a much safer, which will be able to identify much earlier systemic risk building up in financial markets.
Yes, and clearly, I guess if supervisors are confident that they have access to the data, this would also be one of the very essential building blocks for trust.
Yes.
It's often that missing element which also makes supervisors wary.